In 1969, a psychologist parked two identical cars on two different streets. Then he walked away. He wanted to see how long it would take strangers to destroy them. The first car sat abandoned in the Bronx, New York, hood already up. Within 10 minutes, someone had stripped its battery. Within 3 days, it was a gutted metal shell, stripped down to nothing. The second car sat abandoned in Palo Alto, California, outside Stanford University. For over a week, nobody touched it. So the psychologist did something strange. He smashed one window himself with a sledgehammer. Within a few hours, strangers who had ignored the car for days joined in. By nightfall, it looked exactly like the wreck in the Bronx. His name was Philip Zimbardo. Years later, the same man would run one of psychology's most infamous experiments, the Stanford Prison Experiment. But this smaller, stranger study became the seed of something much bigger, an idea about the danger hiding inside a single broken window. In 1982, two academics wrote an essay for the Atlantic Monthly, James Q. Wilson and George Kelling. They gave it a name that would outlive them both, Broken Windows. Their argument was almost elegant in its simplicity. One unrepaired window signals that nobody is watching, nobody cares, so a second window breaks. Then worse things follow. It wasn't a study. It wasn't even really an experiment. It was a thought piece dressed up in the pages of a magazine. Nobody had tested whether any of it held up. And yet it became one of the most consequential ideas in the history of policing. By the late 1980s, New York City's subway system was close to lawless. Crime was rampant underground, and roughly 1 in 6 riders skipped the fare entirely. A transit official named William Bratton decided to test the idea directly, but small. He ordered every graffiti-covered subway car pulled from service until it was cleaned. Then he flooded the turnstiles with plainclothes officers, arresting fare jumpers. Something unexpected happened. Some of those fare jumpers were carrying weapons, or had open warrants. Small enforcement was catching bigger problems almost by accident. Crime in the subway system fell. Bratton became a believer. So did the man who would soon hire him to run the whole city, Mayor Rudy Giuliani. In 1994, Bratton became police commissioner of New York City, and he brought broken windows up from the subway into every street. Officers were told to stop tolerating disorder anywhere, at any scale. Fare beating, graffiti, public urination, unlicensed vendors, aggressive panhandling. It became known as quality of life policing, and then something remarkable happened. At the scale of an entire city, crime in New York collapsed. Murders fell by more than 2/3 within a decade. Broken windows was declared a triumph. A theory born from one man's sledgehammer had apparently saved a city of 8 million people. Except, crime fell almost everywhere across America during those same years, including in cities that never touched broken windows policing at all. Economists spent years trying to untangle why. Childhood lead exposure had been falling for 2 decades, and lead is linked to impulsive, violent behavior later in life. The economy was booming. Incarceration rates had tripled. Policing itself had changed in a dozen overlapping ways too. Separating what broken windows actually caused from what simply happened at the same time turned out to be far harder than one magazine essay ever suggested. But by then, the theory had already left the page. It had become policy. And policy needs targets out on the street every single day. Small disorder is not a neutral category. Someone has to decide in real time what counts as disorder and who looks like they're causing it. In practice, that meant officers stopping people simply because in that moment they looked suspicious enough to check. It had a name, stop and frisk. And in New York City, it grew year after year, almost without limit. By 2011, officers were recording more than 685,000 stops in a single year. That is nearly 2,000 people stopped, questioned, and searched every single day of that year. 87% of those stopped were Black or Latino, in a city where they made up roughly half the population. And in the overwhelming majority of those stops, nothing at all was found. No weapon, no drugs, no contraband, not even an arrest. A weapon was found in less than 1% of all those stops. The theory that began with one broken car window had become a policy that searched millions who had broken nothing. By the 2000s, dozens of American cities had copied the model, from Los Angeles to Chicago to smaller towns most people have never heard of. An idea drafted in a magazine article had become the default assumption of American policing. Meanwhile, researchers finally went back to test the actual idea properly for the first time. In 1999, sociologists Robert Sampson and Stephen Rodenbush drove through more than 190 Chicago blocks, cataloging every scrap of graffiti, every broken window, every abandoned lot. What they found complicated the entire theory. Physical disorder, on its own, barely predicted where violent crime actually happened. What mattered far more was something you cannot photograph from a squad car: whether neighbors trusted each other enough to step in when something was wrong. Sampson called it collective efficacy. A broken window, it turned out, was mostly just a broken window. Then, in 2008, a separate team ran real experiments in the Netherlands. They deliberately left an alley littered with trash, a fence covered in graffiti, a mailbox stuffed with an envelope of cash sticking halfway out. People who walked past the disorder were more likely to litter themselves, or steal the cash, or cut through a fence they weren't supposed to. Small disorder did spread outward. A little. But it said nothing about violent crime. The long chain from broken glass to gunshots was never actually there in the data. The theory that reshaped how millions were policed rested, in the end, on an essay never meant to be tested, and an experiment about litter and stolen mail. In 2013, a courtroom in Manhattan finally confronted what that theory had built. The case was Floyd versus City of New York. One of the plaintiffs, David Floyd, had been stopped by police twice outside his own home for reasons he was never given. Judge Scheindlin ruled that stop and frisk, as it was actually practiced, was unconstitutional, a policy that amounted to racial profiling at a massive citywide scale. An idea that began with one man's sledgehammer had, decades later, been struck down by a federal judge. So what actually breaks a neighborhood down? Not a cracked window, not litter on a sidewalk. What breaks a neighborhood is close to what breaks a person: isolation, disinvestment, the absence of anyone who feels responsible for what happens next. And what actually holds a neighborhood together isn't the absence of graffiti, it's whether the people inside it still believe someone has their back. We looked at broken glass and thought we were reading a neighborhood's character. We were only ever reading its paint job. You've almost certainly acted on this idea, even if you'd never heard its name. Walk into a subway car with graffiti scrawled over every seat, and some part of you tenses up, decides this place is less safe than it actually is. That reflex is exactly what Wilson and Kelling were describing. They just never proved where that reflex should actually lead. One neighborhood gets a coat of paint and a patrol car. Another neighborhood gets treated like the crime already happened. Same crack in the glass. Two completely different responses. Because the theory was never really about the window at all. It was about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. That's the same mistake we make with people, not just places. We see someone who looks like they're struggling and assume we already know their whole story. The truth is almost always further underneath than the surface lets on. A cracked window doesn't tell you why it cracked. A person who looks rough around the edges doesn't tell you what they've survived. And a policy built on appearances will always end up punishing appearances, not the actual danger underneath. New York eventually changed course. Stops fell by more than 90% within a few years of that ruling, and crime did not rise back to where it had been. The city that broken windows theory was supposed to save survived without it, which leaves the theory's original claim harder to defend than ever, not because disorder never matters, but because disorder was never the real danger everyone thought it was. The real danger was a system that acted on a guess for 40 years before anyone checked whether the guess was true. Somewhere in 1969, a man smashed a car window to prove a point about human nature. He was right that people follow the signals around them. He just never got to decide what those signals should mean for a stranger's freedom. That part was left to police departments, courtrooms, and cities, one decision at a time. And for a long time, they got it wrong. Not because the people enforcing it were cruel, but because the theory itself was never given the scrutiny its power deserved. An idea this powerful should have been tested before it was enforced. Instead, it was enforced first and tested decades later on the people who paid for it. David Floyd got his answer in a courtroom. Most people who lived through it never did. So the next broken window you see, on a street or in a person, deserves a second look, not a verdict. Because the crack on the surface is rarely the whole story. It's just the first thing anyone bothered to look at. The window was never the danger. The danger was stopping there and never asking what came before the crack. Some cracks are just cracks. The story was always in what surrounded them.